Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is already nearing the 2-year mark and the world is falling into turmoil ever more as the Israel-Hamas war in the Middle East has shaken up geopolitics as well. Israel strikes continue to hit Gaza amid hunger in the region hitting a record high and the death toll of Gaza residents nearing 20,000. Attacks are also being exchanged not only in the northern part of Israel between Israel and Hezbollah, but also in the Red Sea as the Yemen-backed Houthi group aims to attack all commercial ships heading to and from Israel. Meanwhile, the outlook for Ukraine in 2024 looks bleak as funding from the EU and the US is delayed. How have these two wars affected geopolitics and the global economy, and what do experts forecast for them? For this, we have invited Professor Im Eun-jung from Gwangju National University. Professor Im, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And we also have Professor Matteo LEGRENZI from Ca' Foscari University of Venice. Good to have you with us, Professor LEGRENZI.
It is an honor to be here.
All right, first question to our Professor Im. So this year, the attention of the world has been on two wars. The war in Ukraine sparked by Russia's invasion almost 2 years ago, and the war between Israel and Hamas in the Middle East. Before discussing each war, how have these two wars affected global geopolitics and the global economy?
Well, first of all, let me just emphasize a kind of new rising trend we can see from these two wars. These days we call these two wars as like a hybrid war, because of course we do see the conventional military conflict between the two parties, but not only that, again, all those kind of psychological war or even cognitive war, cyber or like drones, like more non-conventional, those dual-use technologies are also used in the battlefield. And it's very much difficult to separate between the military and the civilian. So all the things are making the situations and more increasingly complex. So having had these kind of very, again, the complex situations, geopolitically speaking, we do see more and more countries are now, on the process of so-called the realigning process. Again, for example, European countries, they also want to, of course, reduce their dependency on the Russian energy sources. And in order to, reduce their dependency on the Russian gas or like those conventional energy sources, they cannot but and they need to move their logistics or those kind of supplies from, European continent itself to other regions, for example, in the Pacific. So we do see this kind of, realigning process, which makes situations more complex. So what I'm trying to say is, again, the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, was kind of, over. However, after that, the pandemic's end, we now see a much more volatile, complex, complicating situations because of these two wars.
All right, I see. So we were able to see the trend of hybrid wars and alignment among certain countries. All right, well, Professor LEGRENZI, let's now talk about the war in the Middle East region first. Though the negotiation is stalled right now, as far as I know, Israel had reportedly offered to pause the fighting in Gaza, the first proposal since the collapse of a deal last month that led to a 7-day ceasefire and the release of more than 100 hostages. What might be the reason behind Israel's this time's offer, and how are their terms for truce differ?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. I mean, basically, the way to look at this, I think, it's that Israel's devastating military pressure on Gaza is a way to raise the price in negotiations. So the more suffering Israelis manage to inflict on the Palestinians in between these pauses, the more they can ask of Hamas in exchange for a pause in terms of hostage release and so on and so forth. I mean, Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's recognized as a terrorist organization by the EU and the UK, but it also has a political role in Palestine. So the Israeli government is pretty insulated from international pressure, particularly under these circumstances. But ultimately, you are right. The voice of the President of the United States has to be taken into account. So look at this sort of military pressure as a way to raise the price and then to sit back at the negotiating table and rising the price in terms of like the number of hostages that are released and possibly other concessions.
All right, I see your point, Professor. We'll hope to see another truce so that more hostages could return home. Now, Professor Im, yes. I'd like to also talk about Washington's position. The U.S. has been steadfast in its support for Israel since the Hamas attack on October 7th. But it did urge Tel Aviv to make a transition from high-intensity operations to lower and more surgical tactics. What is Washington's stance on the war right now?
Well, traditionally speaking, again, the American Democratic Party, they also they have been consistently pretty much supportive for the Jewish people, and even the President Biden himself. I still remember he just mentioned that he identified himself as a Zionist. So, of course, they do have a kind of course, ideologically, religiously kind of, very close sentiment. However, the thing is, these days, American politics is very much divided, as we all know. Biden versus like a Trump, like a very much conflictual situation has been so long. And not only just this issue, any politically sensitive issue can easily just divide up the whole country into the two different camps. And interestingly, these days, the American politics, we do see a kind of generational transition or generation gap too. If you take a look into the kind of public poll data, the younger, again, the people, the respondents are, the more sympathetic they are with the people in Gaza, because those younger people who are, in their 20s or like 30s, they are very much sensitive with the humanitarian issues. So we do see kind of again the gap by even gender or by generation or by their religious belief. And demographically, of course, American society has been becoming more and more diverse. So, from the president's, again, the President Biden's point of view, or from the ruling party, Democratic Party's point of view, they need to think about those voices too. So it might be very much difficult for the current leadership to be just simply supportive for the Israeli government. Again, it's interconnected. Again, international politics, domestic politics are now intertwined. And, as we all know, they will be experiencing another very complicating year because of the president's election. Less than just 1 year left.
Right, I see. So although the U.S. has close sentiment to Israel, it seems people have different views over this war. All right. Now, Professor LEGRENZI, meanwhile, amid the war in Gaza, tensions on Israel's northern front are mounting as well, with Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah exchanging attacks. Could you walk us through why this conflict is taking place? And do you see an all-out conflict with Hezbollah as being inevitable?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the conflict is taking place in a nutshell because Hezbollah is an important part of this axis of resistance to American hegemony that has been organized by Iran in the Middle East, and we're pretty proud about it. So Hezbollah and consequently Iran, they draw a lot of legitimacy in the region from applying military pressure to Israel. It is very unlikely, though, that the situation is going to escalate into a sort of like full-blown conflict, because that would mean the devastation of Lebanon. There has been a clear warning by Israel after the last war that this time the the bombardment would be absolutely like all out and devastating. So neither like Israel or Hezbollah have an interest in an all-out conflict. So what you see on the border right now, it is very serious, but it is more of a choreographed escalation.
All right, I see your point. Thank you for explanation, Professor LEGRENZI. Now, Professor Im, now, not just on the northern part of Israel, concerns are mounting on the Red Sea as well, as attacks by Iran-backed Houthis are on the rise. Could you give us some background on why the Houthi group are demanding that Israel ends its war in Gaza?
So far, whenever I think we see the kind of conflicts or international politics in the Middle East region, absolutely kind of rivalry, competition between the Saudi and Iran, I think is one of the most important variable. Even though they reconciled, having had the Chinese, that kind of coordination, but still, their kind of rivalry between the Saudi and Iran has been so long, and even though they are, religiously speaking, of course, they are all, Muslim. However, they do have, different views on their own, those beliefs or like principle. So-called the Sunni versus like a Shia, but Houthi, they do have more like connections religiously or even politically with Iran. And as the Professor LEGRENZI explained very well, again, the Hezbollah, like the group, they also do have like connections with Iran. These days, actually, North Korea's connections is more, we can hear more about that kind of, again, the connections too. But anyhow, Houthi, they are in the Yemen, their geopolitical position is so important because when we think the connectivity between the Mediterranean Sea and Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, Red Sea is literally in the middle. It's really the choke point that can really interrupt the logistics that connects to Europe and then in the Middle East and Asia. Of course, they do have their own probably strategic goal to complete their own, their kind of, again, the supportive, how would you say, they do have, of course, a supportive the sentiment for the those Palestinian people who are suffering in Gaza, but of course they, at the same time, they do have their own strategic goal, and again, the geostrategically, their location is so much important. So many those, we have now more and more risk in this region that can really cause the kind of cost and the risk of the logistics that again can connect Europe and then Asia.
All right. So Houthi group's attack is taking place for its own reason on the Red Sea. And Professor LEGRENZI, to tackle this, the U.S. announced the creation of an enhanced naval protection force named Operation Prosperity Guardian. If the conflict intensifies, how would that affect global trade and the shipping industry?
That's an excellent question. I mean, it is already driving up insurance prices to the point that many carriers and many sort of like operators, they choose their route around Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, even if it adds weeks to every single journey. So it is already making an impact. And you mentioned the task force. What is very interesting to know and to note is that American regional allies, like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, they've not joined the task force because the one by the Houthi, as it was explained before, like is seen as an act of resistance against Israel. So this is very embarrassing for sort of like the regional allies, which of course welcome the stabilizing influence of the task force, but at the same time, they do not want to be seen as sort of like being too proactive in stemming what is a an act of resistance against Israel, which is now conducting these operations in Gaza.
All right, I see your point, Professor. Now, Professor Im, let's turn our eyes to the war in Ukraine and discussions of the country joining the EU. Hungary's prime minister left the meeting in a pre-agreed manner, after which membership talks between the EU and Ukraine began. What significance does this green light have for Ukraine?
Well, Hungary, as we all know, has been much more reluctant or even negative about the Ukraine's joining to EU. So probably this time, and again, the Hungarian government was trying to be at least more like a neutral about, that kind of direction. But probably more important thing we can think about this kind of, again, the progress is, again, I feel just very, very sad and bad about all this, innocent victims who are dying in the war. However, at the same time, we have to think about the day after the war is concluded. So when the war is concluded, at some point, definitely the Ukrainian economy needs to be restored. And because of this war, even though we don't know yet how the war will be concluded, however, because of Russia's invasion, I can't think the relationship between the Ukraine and Russia can go back to someday in the past when they were in a good pattern. So, which means, again, the Ukraine, they definitely need more like supportive or friendly countries who can back up their economic or even political restoration. So in order to accomplish that kind of goal, I think, the Ukraine's, their membership in the EU is pretty much necessary.
Right, I see. Well, based on what our Professor Lim said, it is indeed a fortunate news for Ukraine to, get the support for the EU membership. However, the Hungary eventually blocked $55 billion worth of EU funding for Ukraine. And though EU leaders said the negotiations would resume next year, what impact would this have on the war in Ukraine, Professor LEGRENZI?
That's an excellent question. I mean, of course, anything that shows a lessening of a commitment by the EU to Ukraine is bound to be welcomed by President Putin. On the other hand, I wouldn't really read too much into it. I mean, this is quite common in EU negotiations. I mean, trying to raise the price, or like one of the countries putting a veto. So I think this could be resolved quite swiftly in the new year. It is interesting to note how the EU has so far been remarkably united and fast in responding to the Russian aggression.
Right, I see. Well, Professor LEGRENZI, one more question. The Ukraine is actually also desperately seeking for the approval of a $61 billion defense aid package from Washington, but that decision is also being delayed. And it seems, the support from Western allies are being either delayed or going to be reduced, considering the U.S. presidential election that is going to come on next year. If that happens, how might that affect the war in Ukraine? Should we expect any peace negotiations to eventually begin?
That's an excellent question. That is certainly what President Putin is counting on. I mean, like the results of elections in the United States. But I mean, quite sincerely, I think that the war in Ukraine is going to end the way the war in Korea ended about 70 years ago. I mean, eventually a line will be drawn because for both parties, a political compromise is seen as impossible. So that's, it will probably end in an armistice, not in a peace treaty. And unfortunately, a wound will be left in the heart of Europe. That is the most likely scenario. I really cannot see sort of peace negotiations developing. It will be military realities that sort of like determine the final settlement the way it has happened in Korea about 70 years ago. This is my prediction.
I see. Well, it is really unfortunate to hear that this war could end in armistice like that happened in Peninsula. Well, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Professor Im. So there are so many variables that we need to consider, but what do you expect for both wars in 2024? What are the scenarios that could play out?
I'm sorry, I don't have a really good answer for this very much complicating situations. And next year, so many elections will be held again in January, Taiwanese president election, and then March, Russian presidential election, and then April, Korea will have the general election, and Japan will have, the president election for the LDP, the ruling party, and then again the November American presidential election. So all this, it's like a two-level game, like Robert Putnam, Harvard professor, said. Again, domestic politics can definitely be influential over the international politics. So it's very much difficult, but I do share my own views too with Professor LEGRENZI. Probably the armistice might be the only realistic way to resolve the situations in Europe so far.
All right, I see your point. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Im and Professor LEGRENZI, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Tuesday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend, and goodbye.